semester. So, often ethics really focuses on our duties to other people. It's a very human-focused enterprise. But the way we set things up at the very beginning of the semester defines ethics much more broadly than that. We asked things like, what kind of lives should we want to live? What kind of people should we want to be? What kind of society should we try to create? And that's not limited to human-human relations. So there's nothing sort of artificial about trying to expand our vocabulary to encompass the environment, the non-human. Within Christian ethics, the overarching questions that I articulated at the beginning of the semester, how ought we to live in response to who God is and what God is doing in creating, in redeeming, and in drawing toward eschatological consummation. So that's not just about where human beings are in relationship to God, but where human beings are in relationship to God's creation, right? So we are finally now at this part of the semester having a couple of sessions where we get to delve into some of those questions. And there is obviously, as with any of the issues we're taking up, so many different angles one could take into this territory. And we're trying to take a couple of discrete angles this session and next Tuesday. So today we're focused on the question of Christianity's responsibility for the ecological crises in which we find ourselves today. Is Christianity responsible? And if Christianity is responsible, what then? In order to meet the ecological crises that currently face us, do we need a fundamentally new religion, a new spirituality? Are Christians stuck with a fundamentally tainted approach to thinking about these questions? That's sort of the question for today. Lynn White, I'll say more about each of these, but Lynn White argues, yes, Christianity is responsible for these crises. Wendell Berry and Pope Francis argue, no, it's much more complicated than that. There might be some Christian complicity, but it's not Christian responsibility, and there are many resources within the Christian tradition for responding to these crises in ways that haven't been fully harvested. Now, what is Karl Barth doing in the conversation today? He predates the ecological crises that we're facing right now, but he would, if we have to have two camps, he would side with Wendell Berry and Pope Francis over against Lynn White. But partly I want to sort of show that there's a complex spectrum of views on this question of exactly how human beings relate to the rest of creation. And it's helpful to get one of these major theological voices in the conversation, and actually kind of helpful to listen in on someone who predates the real crises that we're facing today, and yet I think is also articulating some of the same resources, strands of the tradition that might be productive in moving forward. So how we narrate the history, how we narrate how we got to here, what we identify as key turning points, how we describe ends up being critical to the normative conclusions that we draw. So this is another way of asking that key question, what is going on here? But here, what is going on also requires that we tell maybe a big narrative about how we got to where we are. Next time, we're going to be looking at the relationship between ecocentric approaches and environmental justice approaches, which are sometimes set up as though they're in basic kind of conflict with one another, that the ecocentric environmentalists are trying to dethrone anthropocentrism, and that the eco-justice advocates are decrying privilege given to non-human animals over the poor and the oppressed. So we set these two camps over against one another, where eco-justice approaches might regard mainstream environmentalism as a form of racism, as an expression of settler colonialism. So is there a way to bring these two together so they're not in opposition to one another? And also we'll be reflecting on the question of responses that are focused on worldview versus responses that are focused on practice, practical responses. Do we need to fundamentally change the way we see things, the way we describe things, or fundamentally change what we do? And where do we start? How do we bring those two together? So next time we'll be reading Willis Jenkins, who thinks that worldview-based approaches have been dominant within Christian environmental ethics and are completely inadequate, and he wants to turn to practice-based approaches. We'll also be reading George Tinker next time, who sets out Native American indigenous worldviews as a dramatic corrective to Western Christian worldviews, but also argues that the first step is not to focus on worldview at all. The first step is actually to focus on something very concrete, in his case, on restoring Native sovereignty over ancestral lands, and that we need to get our practices in order and not focus all of our energy on finding the perfect worldview. We're talking about Pope Francis's Laudato Si, both sessions. So there's ways in which I think this is an encyclical that speaks to both of these questions, core questions that we're kind of floating here. All right. Oh, as usual, I fall behind my slides here. My apologies. Okay, so I just want to draw your attention to this visual. I'm not sure how well you can see it, but that is manifest destiny, the spirit of manifest destiny hovering over the westward expansion, envisioned as moving into this untouched wilderness, and that has kind of resourced white environmentalism. You know, let's recover, let's preserve these untouched wildernesses, let's recover them, and a blindness to the fact that these were not empty, untouched wildernesses. These were homelands of indigenous peoples. And so how do we reckon with that history? So that will be more on the table for next time. All right. My cursor is lost. My cursor is really lost. All right, there it is. Okay. All right, so Lynn White. Lynn White's basic argument here is that more science and more technology is not the answer. And I think we are also in a moment now when we recognize that basically the science and technology that we need to meet the ecological crises of the moment exist or are in process of development. That's not really the problem. The problem is political will. The problem is actually transforming practices that require buy-in of powerful corporations as well as ordinary people. So, but what he argues is more science and more technology are not going to get us out of this crisis. What we need is a new religion until we find a new religion or rethink our old one. This is still, this essay, The Historical Roots of Our Ecologic Crisis, this is still the most famous essay in religion and ecology ever, and it was published in 1967. So this is not new, but highly, highly influential. It was published in the journal Science, of all things. You do not get religion and ecology published in the journal Science today. And interestingly, and I think quite tellingly, who was this Lynn White anyway? He was a historian. And more specifically, he was a historian of medieval philosophy, and in particular of science and technology. And I think it's helpful to know that as you read the essay to sort of see, well, why is he focusing on this rather than that? How exactly is he narrating this and why? In any case, he certainly is narrating the ecologic crisis of the present and in a way that places the burden of responsibility at the feet of Christianity. Christianity bears a huge burden of guilt. Now, how does he narrate it such that we come away with this judgment that Christianity is bearing the huge burden of guilt? It's complicated because he does acknowledge that a major shift took place around 1850. 1850, okay, well, that's 19th century. The Christianity has been around for a long time before you get to 1850. What happens in 1850 is the uniting of science and technology, uniting the theoretical and the empirical approaches to nature. And he thinks this is sort of unleashes new forms of transformation. But at the same time, he says, the problems created by this uniting of science and technology are so big that you have to look further back. You have to look in historical depth at the presuppositions that underlie modern science and technology. So to find these presuppositions, that's what he's looking to Christianity for. These presuppositions, he says, are distinctively Western and distinctively Christian. Again, there's complexity here. He acknowledges there were technologies that were not Western. There were Chinese technologies, there were Islamic technologies that flowed into the West and that were then, but they were grabbed onto by a Christian attitude. Technical dominance that was created by the marriage of some new technologies and these presuppositions, these attitudes, meant that technical dominance was achieved globally by the Christian West already in the Middle Ages. And he points to the invention of the cross-cut plow as decisive. A cross-cut plow is not modern technology, but it is a piece of technology. It's an important piece of agricultural technology. And he thinks that with this invention, we see the human relationship to the soil, and therefore to the environment at large, is profoundly changed. So the human is no longer just part of nature. The human is the exploiter of nature. So where does the cross-cut plow come from? Well, fundamentally, his answer to this is that the cross-cut plow and then other technical inventions emerge out of an exploitative attitude in the West. The critical thing, again, is the attitude, the exploitative attitude, a conception of the human as separate from nature, as master of nature. That only the human is made in God's image. Although the human is made of clay, is made of the earth, the human is not part of nature. The human is decisively separate from nature. And that everything else in the natural world is made to serve the human, made for human purposes, made for human exploitation. So Christianity is the most anthropocentric religion. And in fact, it is God's will that human beings exploit nature for human ends. This is the narration. So there's a displacement of pagan animism, which respected all things, honored all things, found the holy in all things. And instead, there's an indifference to natural objects. They're just objects, they're just things, they're just matter. Intelligence is applied to understanding how things work so that exploitation will be more powerful, more possible. To a Christian, he says, a tree can be no more than a physical fact. Physical fact, you figure out how it works, then you know how to do things with it. So I pause just for a moment here. I would love to hear your initial responses to how he's narrating things here and the power of this narration. Is this ringing true to you as a narration? What are the elements that ring true to you in this narration? So I want to acknowledge that even though Lynn White starts by saying we're going to need a new religion, he also leaves room for rethinking the old religion. And he does identify a resource for potentially rethinking Christianity. And he turns to St. Francis. And I have to say, this is not a plan. I did not design this course thinking, every few weeks I'll make sure I talk about St. Francis. But it does just so happen that Francis does pop up a lot in relationship to many different issues. And Lynn White calls him the greatest radical in Christian history since Christ. So is appealing to that sort of radical character. And really sees him as breaking out of anthropocentrism, setting up a democracy of all creatures, and goes so far as to suggest that he embraces a kind of panpsychism, so spirit in all things, animate as well as inanimate, and all things glorifying the Creator. So there are resources in the tradition for this kind of radical reinvention, and he thinks the crisis will continue as long as Christianity continues business as usual, but that there might be something to be said for kind of radical reinvention. And he does think that that religion, not necessarily Christianity, but religion has to be part of the solution. Since the roots of our trouble are so largely religious, the remedy must also be essentially religious. And that's an interesting claim, too. So despite his deep criticism of Christianity, he does have a sense that there must be a religious remedy. Now, of course, that wouldn't have to be Christianity necessarily. It could be a new religion that we're in the process of inventing. It could draw on various religious traditions. We might think of the universe story, Journey of the Universe, the kind of project that if you're aware of it, Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm are engaged in, drawing together the world's religious traditions, trying to kind of create a new story, a new grand narrative of how all living things relate to the earth on which we live. And that does flow from a sense that the remedy has to be religious, that science and technology alone will not save us. So, he sets up the problem in this way. The root of the problem is religious. The solution must be religious. Christianity is to blame, but there are some resources visible for an alternative. But I think it's worth asking whether it's the case that the technological developments that spurred the West, starting, let's say, with the crosscut saw or with the plow or whatever, emerged out of an ideology of the domination and exploitation of nature, whether that accurately captures the attitude toward nature at the time of these inventions. Or is this maybe inverting the reality that the ideology of exploitation emerges after some of these technologies develop and becomes a justification? And certainly people are always very good at finding justifications for their attitudes and their ways of life in their holy scriptures, right? Finding a narrative that justifies what they are engaged in. There are other ways of reading the creation story. There are other ways of reading the place of the human in the cosmos as one among many creatures. Creature is a term that is threaded through the Hebrew Bible. The emphasis, the underscoring on the common status of the human being as creature. And we've already touched on the understanding of the human as place in the garden to tend the garden. Maybe still want to wrestle with that. Maybe that's still placing the human in a very special role, but it's tending, it's not domination, it's not exploitation, it's not identifying nature as human property to be exploited or destroyed at will. It is God's beloved creation. It's God's purposes that are to be honored. And if that is deeply present in the tradition, then St. Francis makes more sense. He looks less like an aberration. He looks less like he comes out of nowhere, and more like he's lifting up strands that were present in the tradition and accentuating them. So maybe the task is less monumental than White implies, if the task is coming up with a religious worldview. But is a worldview going to be sufficient to meet the crisis? That's sort of the question to leave hanging until next time. But let's keep discussing the worldview kind of question. And with that, let us turn our attention to Karl Barth. And we're looking here at Volume 3, Part 4 of the Church Dogmatics, written in 1951. Okay, so Certainly, there's a reality of pollution, there's a reality of human transformation in the environment, but we're not in 1951 where we are today. And he's taking up in this little bit of the church dogmatics the question specifically of the human relationship to non-human animals and to plants. And it's really an investigation that is spurred on by the influence of Albert Schweitzer and Schweitzer's reverence for life. And Barth really here is responding to Schweitzer. So Schweitzer was a remarkable figure. He was a doctor, he was an organist, he was a theologian. He wrote this very important book on the quest for the historical Jesus that emphasized Jesus' eschatological expectations. Then he went off to Equatorial Africa and founded a hospital there, was there for many years. And in 1952, he received the Nobel Peace Prize for his philosophy that was articulated in reverence for life. So a very, very interesting figure. And the core idea here is that the will to life in all living things is something that should be honored and respected. There should be a spiritual relation to all living things. So Barth is grappling with this. And as we saw earlier in the semester, at the center of Barth's ethics is its Christocentrism. But by virtue of its Christocentrism, there is a kind of inevitable focus on the human, shall we say, in Karl Barth's ethics. So I think he's encountering Schweitzer and he's saying, oh, am I wrong about this? Do I need to reconfigure this in some way? So as Barth narrates the grand, this grand story of Christianity, God seeks to be in covenant partnership with humankind. And in fact, creation exists for the sake of this partnership. Why does God create? God creates to be in partnership with creature. And this partnership has been realized in Jesus Christ. It's already complete. The partnership is there. And in Jesus Christ, all of humankind is made a partner in God's covenant. All of humankind is elected for divine grace, which is a radical thing for a Reformed thinker to say, right? All are elected for grace. And the call then is to affirm the covenant that has already been fulfilled in Jesus. And it's focused on the human. And why is it focused on the human? Well, I think it's focused on the human for Barth because he thinks that covenant partnership requires intentional acceptance. You have to accept this invitation to become a partner with God. So if that's the case, what about the rest of creation? Where does the rest of creation reside in relationship to this covenant for which creation was established? And that's the question that he's wrestling with here. And he suggests that there's a lot we cannot say here. Enigma. There's a lot here that is an enigma. He wants to affirm, though, something central. Animal life, non-human life, comes from God and is moving toward God. Kind of restatement of the grand theme of Neoplatonic Christianity, of the exodus and reditus of creation, that all of creation comes from God and returns to God. And that is not just the human returning to God. But he thinks that it's just not that clear what it means to respect non-human life. What does it mean to have Schweitzer's reverence for life? What flows from that in terms of what you do and what you cannot do? And here Barth is kind of skeptical in the sense that he's agnostic. He doesn't know, he thinks we cannot know from the inside what it is to be one of these other forms of life. We can only understand them from the outside. But, he says, despite that ignorance, that he thinks is pretty permanent ignorance, there is human responsibility toward non-human life. creation is good. Creation is affirmed as good. So wanton destruction of creation is certainly bad. And other living things do not belong to the human. Other living things belong only to God. So that's a rebuke to a view on which everything other than the human exists for the exploitation by the human. It's not dominion theology. And yet, again, we want to acknowledge that there is something here that sees the human's activity in the world as somehow central. So there's a special responsibility toward other living things. But he says that this rests on the world of animals and plants forming a living background to the living space divinely allotted to man and placed under his control. An indispensable living background. So it's just a background. He doesn't have this view of the animacy of all creation. It's not this radical view of the spirit permeating all things. So again, he's operating in a kind of a middle space here. Domesticating animals is good, he argues, but that's not domination. It's making profitable use of the surplus forces of nature in the animal world. He says you can work with animals in a way that works with them, works with their own desires. You work with animals who are willing and glad to work with humans. There's interesting reflection along those lines by people who engage in dog training and horse training, that it's not domination, you're not imposing your will on them, but you're working with their native desires and tendencies. So we could say he wants to distinguish use from abuse, use from domination, use from exploitation. And the limits here are set by the fact that all creation is God's creation. It is not humans' creation. He underscores that animals are given to humans as food only after the fall. This does not reflect God's original creative will for the world. It's a consequence of the fall that life may be taken. So he actually argues that killing another animal is similar to homicide. We have to take it very, very seriously. It's removing a unique creature that exists in an individuality which we cannot deny. Just because we cannot fathom it, just because we have to say there's an enigma here, he doesn't think that justifies denying the unique individuality of this creature as beloved creation of God, as beloved by God. So how is it that we can take animal life? Well, he says we can take it only by way of sacrifice to God and receiving this sacrifice back from God. This is a reminder that the lives of other creatures do not belong to us, they belong to God. And it's a constant injunction to take life only when necessary to take life. One must have good reason to take life. These are innocent victims. And what's interesting here is the ways in which this treatment of human taking of animal life is actually reminiscent of some themes that we see in indigenous reflection on the taking of life. Form of sacrifice, form of you receive it as gift, you acknowledge the gift. If you don't acknowledge the gift, there's a violation there. He talks about vegetarianism, suggests it might be a wanton anticipation of the eschaton. But he leaves it up in the air. So that's an interesting thought, right? Eschatologically, human beings should not be killing other animals. the creation was intended to be such that the taking of life would not be necessary. But it's unclear, where are we in this narrative, right? We're in the fall, and we're not yet in the eschaton. So how do we act when we inhabit that uncomfortable moment? And his basic answer to that is we inhabit it through sacrifice, through recognizing all of creation belongs to God. It's God's beloved creation. It's not ours. So Barth is clearly not a radical environmentalist, right? But I think it's interesting to see where he is in 1951, trying to sort through these critical ideas, certainly narrating things in a way that would challenge some of Lynn White's narration, would suggest that it's not only in a radical like St. Francis that you find Christian resistance to the notion of human domination and exploitation of the natural world, seeing that as much more central to the Christian tradition and not something on the margins. Let's bring in a third voice here, that of Wendell Berry. Wendell Berry is maybe not quite as diversely gifted as Albert Schweitzer, but a very impressive character in his own right. A novelist, a poet, an environmentalist. He's from Kentucky. He's still living. He's 88 years old. He's not an academic. He has taught creative writing over the years at various institutions, but it's better to see him, as a writer, as a nature writer, and as, through his writing, an important environmentalist. So this is an essay, Christianity and the Survival of Creation, from 1993, just to kind of situate when this is being written. And Berry thinks the indictment of Christianity that comes from Lynn White is justified in many respects. And he is fully aware that this is not just an indictment for the destruction of pristine wilderness and wildlife, but it's also an indictment for the destructions that were inflicted by settler colonialism. So he's inhabiting the beginnings of white environmentalist reckoning with that reality. But he argues it's not a fair indictment. Lynn White's narration is not a fair indictment of the Bible or of Christian tradition as truly descended from the Bible. So we get this wrestling for how to interpret Bible, wrestling for who gets to own the tradition, right? There are many owners of Christian tradition, but he's trying to stake his claim, while acknowledging that there are catastrophic discrepancies between biblical instruction and Christian behavior. Catastrophic discrepancies. So Christians have not lived according to what the Bible articulates as the proper human relation to the non-human. So if that's the case, why not just dispose of Christianity? If the indictment is pretty much on the mark, and if there are these catastrophic discrepancies in terms of how Christianity has actually developed and been lived out, White's answer is, well, Christianity caused the problem, so we have to kind of fix it with a religious solution. Maybe it's a Christian solution that's radically revising Christianity. Wendell Berry's answer is that Christians are stuck with it, in a way. I mean, that's sort of a simplification of his answer. He says we can turn away from it, away from Christianity, or we can turn against it, but that will only bind us tightly to a reduced version of it. It's an interesting claim that turning against Christianity because of this conviction of Christianity's responsibility for environmental crisis will bind us tightly to a reduced version of Christianity. And we might ponder what exactly he means by that, but part of the idea here is what you reject. You remain kind of connected to what you reject because you're pushing back against it. And in this case, you'd be pushing back against a version of Christianity, which would be the version that is narrated by Lynn White, right? You'd be pushing back against Christianity as preaching the domination and exploitation of nature. So he tries to move in a different direction, a different kind of narration, counter to Lynn White's reading. So according to the Bible, we don't own the world. We don't own any part of the world. Sure, there's talk of land ownership in the Bible, but it's really limited. You look at the Hebrew Bible and how it talks about land ownership. We talked about this a bit when we were talking about property. We are finally strangers and sojourners. The land is God's. The land reverts to God to address the inequalities in human relationships. But that's also a reminder that the land is not ultimately ours for our purposes, for our desires and projects, but the land is there for God's pleasure and God's purposes. And if we are not honoring God's purposes, then our ownership is a travesty. Further, we're not independent of God. Creation is the constant participation of all creatures in the being of God. So we think wrongly of God's transcendence as opposed to God's immanence. God is immanent and transcendent. God is intimate to all creatures. And that's a way of correcting this notion of human exceptionalism, of human beings as somehow closer to God. Everything else is over here, and we're close to God. It is not just Adam who has the Spirit of God breathed into them. It's every creature is given a portion of the breath and Spirit of God. We are holy creatures living among other holy creatures in a world that is holy. So we have a right to use the gifts of nature, he thinks, but not to ruin or waste them. And in using the gifts of nature, we are to use them to God's purposes, not to ours. So if that is a faithful rendering of scriptural tradition and of the way it points human beings in relationship to the world, then how did Christianity become so complicit in the destruction of nature? How did religion become this supporter of human exceptionalism? So he thinks one critical piece of this was the way in which religion became separate from economy, right? From the ways of human housekeeping, the economics as the care of the household becomes separate from the sphere of religion, is set free and becomes the space of exploitation and domination, knowing for the sake of using to our purposes. But more fundamentally, he thinks the problem is dualism. The problem is a host of dualisms: creator over against creature, spirit over against matter, religion over against nature, religion over against economy, worship over against work. We fall into dualism. And when we do, we lose our understanding of ourselves as living souls, as dust and breath. Dust and breath. Members of the holy community of creation. And then we mistreat material reality. We seek to escape from material reality as though we ever could be separate from the rest of creation. How is this to be resolved? I mean, clearly he has done the work of re-narration. So at that level, he thinks re-narration is important. He's a writer, after all. So in that sense, you could say he does think that getting our worldview right or our story right is critical. But he also argues that fundamentally, the problem of the complicity of Christianity in the destruction of the natural world needs to be addressed by our doing, by work. And yet, the significance of that doing, of that work, the way in which we plow or plant, is determined by our understanding of the story in which we are taking part. So a deed that we do whatever it may be, right? The baking of a loaf of bread, the buying of something in a store. It is not understandable simply on its own. The actual deed is inflected by the stories that we tell, our self-understanding, that's perception of the reality within which we are acting. And if we grasp that at a deep level, we can reunite work and art and worship into one, healing some of these divides that have grown up over time. All right, we have a few minutes to begin to dive into Laudato Si. My missing cursor. I'm going to have to bring a mouse next time. I don't know where my cursor is. There we go. All right. So Laudato Si is from 2015, so not long ago at all. And I think one of the important things when reading this encyclical is to notice that it's addressed to all human beings, all who can read and receive the word. It's not just addressed to Catholics, and it's not just addressed to Christians. It's not even just addressed to theists, let's say, or people of faith. He's trying to work at multiple levels in a way that can speak to everyone. Of course, not everyone's going to want to listen to the Pope, but actually a lot of people do listen to the Pope. So there are particularistic theological reflections in the encyclical, Christian stuff, but he also moves from that into reflection that doesn't assume shared theological commitments. And not surprisingly, Francis of Assisi comes back again, right? So Pope Francis claims Francis of Assisi. He claims the name Francis as his papal name due to his admiration for St. Francis of Assisi's concern for all living creatures and due to his own concern for the ecological crisis. So it's not surprising that we get this Pope issuing the first environmental encyclical. Do we need a new religion to respond to the ecological crisis? Not surprisingly, the Pope says no. Surprise, surprise. But we do need to disentangle Christianity from distorted understandings. And we need to engage in dialogue with all peoples. Christians cannot remain in a bubble. Christians need to be in conversation. And that involves welcoming the wisdom of indigenous peoples. And here we have the complex territory of how to listen and welcome that wisdom without appropriating it and whitewashing one's own tradition in ways that make it look out as though that wisdom has always been native to one's own. What is most to blame, Francis argues, is not Christianity. It's the modern technocratic paradigm. And he adopts this modern technocratic paradigm from Romano Guardini. And bound up with this technocratic paradigm is a false notion of human freedom that's focused on consumption and control, that idealizes ceaseless progress and growth, upholds technology as the resolution to all of our problems. Those aren't Christian ideas. Christianity, in its early days, does not conceive of the possibility that human beings can transform the world. God can transform the world. God will transform the world, but human beings aren't going to do that. So Pope Francis argues that that is the modern technocratic paradigm. But as we'll see next time, important as he thinks it is to kind of narrate the story correctly here, he doesn't think that that resolves the ecological crisis or crises, that that's a holistic matter. It involves spiritual practices. It involves practices of daily consumption. It involves grassroots politics. It involves legal frameworks, policy, global agreements. So what he calls integral ecology. We have to be thinking at many, many different levels. Only part of it is going to be, let's narrate this story right.